Right. A very good evening to you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me nuance my own comments by concentrating on Nigeria as opposed to taking the kind of broad swipe. And let me also crave your indulgence to be an economist. I don't run a business. Well, that's not strictly correct, given that I have a target to meet this year. But let me behave as an economist. When we talk about volatility, and when you talk about it in the Nigerian context in particular, there are a number of things that are pretty clear and which I think sometimes we ignore at our own peril. That much of the source of volatility in Nigeria at a macro level is actually from factors over which Nigeria has no control. In other words, there are actually external things that shape or are very, I'm not going to go down the line of saying are more important, even though I think they're more important than domestic parameters in shaping and driving volatility. One thing in particular is very, very important as far as Nigeria is concerned and the volatility of our environment is concerned. And that's what happens to oil. Today, we've been reading in the news the attack on, I think it's 2 vessels in the Middle East. We're going to see what happens. But for Nigeria, one of the key challenges that as business executives you face is keeping your eyes peeled for things outside Nigeria. And I would give you 4 key things that I think attention should not deviate from. The first, of course, is what I've just said. What happens to oil prices? Because for Nigeria, oil is important in 2 dimensions. The first is price, over which we have no control. The other is quantity, over which increasingly we appear not to have control. And the loss of control on quantity arises from 2 dimensions. First, there is OPEC. So the reason why oil prices got to about $74 or thereabout and has seen almost a 20% decline in the period of 1 month is simply OPEC. Indeed, I was looking at some notes the other day where the Russian minister is quoted as saying, if OPEC does not continue to sustain the reduction in volumes that has kept so far, oil could go as far down as $40 a barrel. Now, so if anybody is saying we're doing scenario planning, a scenario has already been defined that if the agreement in OPEC breaks down, Nigeria is potentially looking at a $40 a barrel of oil. Now, that creates a problem. The issues of terrorism were raised. And one has to be mindful. 2014, if my memory serves right, 1.4 million barrels of crude oil, and we were all in real trouble. And the key question is that possible anytime soon? The answer is, don't rule it out. Don't rule it out. Because as we see the specter of insecurity rise across the land, the question is, will it stoke ethnic nationalism? If it does, what happens to oil? So that's important. Second thing that's very important externally that we must pay attention to is international policy. And in my view, right now, we tend to worry more about the Federal Reserve. But I think attention is actually moving away from the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve has essentially said to all of us, you know what, we are not going to be as hawkish on interest rate movement as we originally planned. But the US fiscal deficit is now a real source of bother. Currently, we're looking at a United States that planning for 2019 to borrow $20 billion short of $1 trillion, which means interest rates will continue to have upward pressure placed on it. And so, for a country like Nigeria, the point was made about capital. Are we going to be a capital importing? Are we going to be a destination for capital or not? The third thing that I tend to worry about is capital. So I've spoken about policy, which is where whatever the central banks do is very important. But what capital does is also very important. My sense is interest rates, international interest rates, northbound. Maybe slow, but northbound. Strong dollars. Question then is, what happens to our attraction as a destination for capital? A couple of years ago, we were looking at Nigeria taking in about $20 billion of international capital annually. Today, we're nowhere near there. And now there are fears as to what might happen to us over the next 4 years if the world's perception of our economy doesn't change positively very quickly. And of course, the fourth thing that economists like me concern ourselves about in terms of the international environment is diaspora transfers. When you ask, most people tell you, oh, what goes through the banking system is probably about $6-7 billion. But guess what? That's only one channel. Currently, you're looking at diaspora transfers 22 to $25 billion annually. But guess what as well? We really don't have any handle on who gets it, how much do they get, from where are they getting it, but most importantly, what are they spending it on? Now, what am I saying so far? Oh yes, one is that international things are very important in trying to understand the volatilities that we see in the Nigerian environment. But the other thing that I am saying is that we need to understand and be prepared for those international things in order to make our domestic judgments. Far too long, in my view, we ignore the internationals and concentrate too much on the domestic. And yet, for some of us, the international environment is, I would argue, probably more important than the domestic environment. But we'll come back to that. What else should I say? If you look, in terms of some of the myths around Nigeria, there are a couple that I think we need to pay some attention to. Of course, first of all, we kind of persuade ourselves how large an economy this is. Yeah, 200 million people, we are told. Please note what I say. 200 million people, we are told. The data shows that Nigeria's population doubles every 30 years. But guess what? All the sources of this data are tainted. Census in 1953, disputed. Census in 1963, disputed. Census in 1973, disputed. Census in 2006, disputed. Indeed, Lagos, where we are, has no official population. Why? Because in 2006, post-census, the disputes at this population commission, the population tribunal, invalidated the results in 14 out of 20 local governments in Lagos. And so when Lagos tells you we are 22.8 million, 24.6 million, I was very curious. So how do people know that we're this many? And they say to me, well, we know how much refuse we collect. Okay, kind of makes sense. But how does that translate into your population? Ah, yes. We apply the conversion rates that apply to London. Really? The conversion rates or the refuse generation rates that apply to London is what we have applied in Lagos and arrived at a population of 20 whatever million. Now, what that already tells you is that for a lot of stuff around the Nigerian economy, we are guesstimating. We are not estimating, we are guesstimating. Now, one of the things that's pretty clear, so when you say, oh, it's a large economy, well, I worry. Oh, yeah, large economy, $417 billion. It's the largest on the continent. All right. Divide that by 200 million. And then tell me what you're left with. Put the data as it is. So it's a large market, Abi. $470-something billion. Okay, but the moment you divide it by 200 million people, it actually becomes rather a small market. Because it moves from, yes, it remains the largest on the continent, but in terms of per capita income, you're now talking of just over $2,000 lower middle income status. Low income is $998. Lower middle income goes as far as just short of $4,000. So we're essentially a lower middle income country. But our view of the world is we're big. Or our view of ourselves is we're big. What else are the myths around kind of what we do or say? Ah, yes, I shouldn't forget that. We say that a strong currency is evidence of national economic virility. Interesting. But for some of us who study these things, or I should say more accurately, who are paid to study these things, a strong currency is essentially an open passport to importation. Essentially, it's the easiest route to exporting jobs. And yet we say 23% of the labor force is unemployed, 17% is underemployed, 40% of the labor force is either unemployed or underemployed. Ah, yes, people do remind me very often. Yes. If we do our currency one way or the other, if we continue to allow the currency to devalue, nothing happens, we are not going to produce anything. And I keep saying to them, have we ever tried to actually encourage production in this country? Really, have we ever meaningfully tried to encourage production? Oh, those of us in this room are the people who sit in the councils of policy making. And our tastes are what determines where policy goes. A couple of years ago, of course, I sat on the MPC. And I remember then, exchange rate, black market, 520 naira to the dollar. The noise on Twitter land, on Facebook land, on social media, and the newspapers was phenomenal. And then guess what the central bank did? Co-opted the entire middle class into the subsidies on currency, allowing everybody who wants to pay health bills, pay school fees, pay mortgages to take it at official rates, and everything dried up. No complaints, we're happy. But what strikes me as being quite interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see where this ends, is that we're one of those countries that celebrates reserves we don't understand. Currently, our reserves stand about $44 billion, something like that. And we publish this on a daily basis, and we're very happy. And I keep asking myself, is it really about the reserves, or should it not be about the productive capacity of this country? In my view, Nigeria has the number four, largest or most diversified manufacturing sector on the continent. But Nigeria is unwilling to be a producer. For as long as A strong currency is what we are pursuing. And by the way, the only reason why we want a strong currency is so that people like you and I can get our bills paid more cheaply. You can go on holiday, get your school children's fees paid, get your medical bills paid. It's not really about the Nigerian economy per se. Because if it's about the Nigerian economy, one of the things we would have recognized is that in which country with 200 million people plus do you move in 2010 from agriculture employing 30% of your labor to 2018 and agriculture is employing 48% of your labor? Standard economics says that is wrong. It's very simple. What was supposed to happen is labor drifts out of agriculture into urban settings, into industry. But in Nigeria, the reverse is the case. And I don't understand it. And yet we're surprised that the economy isn't performing well. Guess what's happened? Almost half of the labor force is now in agriculture. The output per head in agriculture is 27% down on where it was 8 years ago. Why? Very simple now. You've got more people drifting in. The productivity of the sector is dropping. Agriculture is growing at about 2.5%. Once upon a time, it used to grow by 5%. 6.5% even. And so for some of us, we're looking at some of these structural things and saying to ourselves, sorry, we are cocooning ourselves in a nice myth-reading attempt to avoid reality. We're trying as hard as we can to avoid reality. We argue on a regular basis, if you were to make markets determine some prices, it's very bad. In fact, it's excruciatingly very bad. An example? Recall 2012, privatization of electricity. What was supposed to happen is the creation of a market, moving away from government hands into private sector. What you're supposed to regulate thereafter is a market, not a sector. But guess what? 2014 arrives. MITO. You pass the first round of MITO. Second round of MITO is due just before the elections. You say no. A new government succeeds, accedes to power, and hasn't done anything on MITO. Therefore, tariffs are not cost reflective. And yet, all of us are waiting for power. How? And then we say the economy is volatile, unpredictable, complex, ambiguous. It ain't any of this stuff. These are things that we have done. One of Nigeria's foremost industrialists is quoted in the papers this week as saying, see, in the last 18 months, Egypt has put